And good morning from Vancouver, British Columbia. It's good morning here. For you, it's perhaps good afternoon or even good evening over there, further east from where I am. When I was asked to speak about Anne of Green Gables and the author Lucy Maud Montgomery, I was delighted to be able to accept that invitation. As a child, I had identified with Anne. Now, I didn't have red braids, but I had plain brown braids. We called them pigtails back then, and I got teased about that, of course. I was in a one-room school up to grade 8, and so I got to read all the books up to grade 8, even when I was in grades 2 and 3. It nourished my love of reading, and it stimulated my imagination. In fact, my family says I still have a pretty lively imagination. When I got into high school, there was no Gilbert as such, as we'll learn about in our talk today, but there were other boys, and I was out to beat the boys, even in math, even in geometry. That was Anne's challenge. One bothersome matter was that my middle name was Anne, but plain Anne, without the E. Well, later on, I would read the story of Anne of Green Gables to our twin sons. They were born and raised in Montreal, so when it was time for family vacations, we could easily get to Prince Edward Island. First visit in family was when they were 1 year old, and we've been back many times since. When the fellows left home, I was still able to get back to Prince Edward Island, the land of Anne and of Lucy Maud Montgomery, but in a different context. I had been a sessional lecturer in the geography department at the French Language University of Montreal. And in 2005, I was able to transfer some of my course material into a talk for on a cruise ship. So since that February 2005, first itinerary that I did, I've been able to go on itineraries all around the world, including Prince Edward Island, talking about the history of the destinations we'll be visiting. And I usually use a biographic approach, so that today when I'm going to be talking about Anne and her author, Lucy Maud Montgomery, I'll actually be giving more of the environment in which they lived, the historical, geographical, socio-cultural, and even political environment in which those two women, that young girl Anne, that fictitious girl, but came alive through the pen of Lucy Maud Montgomery. And it's been mentioned, this is the week that celebrates books and literature, World Book Day. You'll notice that the date there, celebrating 25 years, is the 3rd of March. Also notice the eyes in that book. Look where they're looking. They're looking over at Anne, this centennial edition of Anne of Green Gables, and the book that she's holding in her hand. When I contacted World Book Day tell them what I wanted to do, I had a different image, and the eyes were looking elsewhere, and they actually sent me back this one. She says, they're looking at Anne. So thank you very much, the folks at World Book Day. Yes, this Canadian classic for all ages around the world has been around now 114 years. Lucy Maud Montgomery herself said as a child, I love books. I hope when I grow up to be able to have lots of them. Would she have imagined how many people, how many ages around the world have her books in their library? It was something she probably didn't dream could have happened. Anne's lasting popularity may well be due to Montgomery's own ability, her skill in making her characters and the landscapes so come alive, reflecting life as it was, ordinary life, life that she had experienced. Sometimes she really described life as she wished it could have been. Anne Shirley became a mythic icon of Canadian culture so many years ago, but the author of Anne has written just so much more, maybe 500 short stories, articles, poetry, letters, as well as, yes, her own journals. In Canada, she's, been declared a person of national historic significance. In this Canadian encyclopedia online, you can read more of that story looking under Lucy Maud Montgomery. As for Prince Edward Island, it's the only place on earth my heart would ever truly love. Montgomery truly did love Prince Edward Island. Now, it's the smallest of our Canadian provinces. It's only about 140 miles long and 2 to 40 miles in width. The population in 2021 estimation, it was just 165,000. So obviously a lot less when Maud Montgomery lived there. And we'll find too that the distance between Cavendish and Charlottetown might have only been about 25 miles, but the roads weren't anything, and horse and buggy would have taken a lot longer to get around the country. You'll notice too the date of her birth. It was just 10 years prior to her birth that the Charlottetown Conference had led the way to Confederation. Prince Edward Island is considered to be Canada's birthplace, but even though it would only join Confederation in 1873, the year just before Lucy Maud Montgomery was born there. We're going to zero in on Atlantic Canada. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had been two of the provinces who first got into Confederation back there in 1867. The other two were Ontario and Quebec. And we're going to zero in even further because we're going to only talk about Prince Edward Island and a little bit of Nova Scotia. Definitely it fits into the picture. Prince Edward Island, this small land, is going to be mostly in our talk, but Cavendish in particular. So we'll look at Cavendish closer. So this gives a bit of a view of what we're going to see. Now, those interested in Anne, those of you who are watching me simply because you're a reader and you like a good yarn. Maybe you've really gotten involved with the Anne books and are a fan and want anything about Anne will catch your attention. Some of you watching are probably scholars of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and therefore it includes her books. But there's scholars now, a whole body of research and work that is now featuring and specializing in Lucy Maud Montgomery. And we'll see more of this throughout my talk. Maybe you're just an informed tourist and you're going to be going on a tour to Prince Edward Island, so you want to know a little more about their daughter, Montgomery, about the area, about Anne. There is a map that has been produced by Central Coastal PEI, and it talks about everything to love about Anne. But that very map can be used to help identify sites that are related to the life of Lucy Maud Montgomery herself, because their stories are so intertwined, just like the braid that I put on the side of the picture there. In fact, this map was used when there was going to be a conference in 2020 about Lucy Maud Montgomery. And because it couldn't happen, they actually put it onto a virtual version. And there's the script that is going on. And you can actually look at that on the Journal of Lucy Maud Montgomery, LM Montgomery Studies. You'll see this address once again. The interesting thing that I just found out that biennial conference on the life and works of Montgomery is going to happen this year in June. And they're going to do that same tour. That same tour is going to be offered at that conference, but live this time. I will mention that perhaps again later. Well, I'm going to put Anne and Maud, because she went by Maud, back into the background as I look at a little bit more about World Book Day and its goals. Its vision is that more children from all backgrounds develop a lifelong habit of reading for pleasure, that they benefit from the improved life chances that this brings them. You can find more explanation of the vision on the website, but note that it's reading for pleasure, not just because it's a have-to book, whether it's a child or as an adult. And it's going to be a lifelong habit, so it may start as children, but we as adults can get a lot of benefits from reading for pleasure. One of the examples, for example, is the books of Hans Christian Andersen, who we think of as fairy tales for children. There's so much in it, in the writing of Andersen, that's for adults too. In fact, he called his own life a fairy tale of a life. those books are actually showing these benefits of reading for pleasure. Well, even adults can enter the world with pleasure. This friend of mine, we were on a cruise again. I was a speaker, and she got off the ship with me and tried on the hat of Anne. So we had a good laugh. She's just holding back from laughing in that picture. But then, of course, you can get back and read the books of Anne as well. World Book Day was first celebrated, yes, 25 years ago in UK and Ireland, 1997. But it was 2 years before that UNESCO brought up this idea of having a day to celebrate books and reading worldwide. Now, the date that they assigned was the 23rd of April. That date, the observance of that date in the UK was moved to March 3rd simply to avoid conflict with the Easter school holidays and with St. George's Day. But the concept is the same as for UNESCO, because that date actually signifies or is symbolic of the anniversary of the death of several literary giants. The best we might know of are Shakespeare. He died on that date. Cervantes happened to die on that date, and actually it turns out in the same year. But we're not celebrating their death. We're celebrating their words that have lived on centuries after they died. On the UNESCO website, they write that at any time, but particularly during these recent years of limited travel, books have proven to be an ideal source for combating isolation. In fact, one of UNESCO's current themes is saying, with a book, you're never alone. Books also reinforce ties between people, especially if you're in a book club, even if it's online. It can expand our horizons while stimulating our minds and our creativity. And we can travel. We can travel thanks to the imagination. Imagination is definitely part of Montgomery's being and of Anne of Green Gables as well. UNESCO also encourages us to make a difference, change a bit, and explore new topics, new formats, something different, out of the ordinary. Get something new to stimulate. Well, the books of Anne of Green Gables might be out of your current ordinary. Maybe you read some of them when you were young. Why not read it again? I just reread it in preparing, and I was laughing just like I would have been in younger years. And probably even more, I understood some of the humor. So get on and read some more of the Anne series. Or get a biography of Lucy Maud Montgomery. This book here that I put up, I got out of the library, and it's said to be for ages 8 to 12. I had a pleasure in reading it. There are actually pictures taken from the archives. There's cartoon type of things. There's a beautiful write-up of different aspects of the life of Lucy Maud Montgomery. This book that brought to life this iconic Canadian character has been translated into over 30 languages, including Braille. Actually, I think it's up to 36 now. A Swedish translation came out just 1 year later. A few others came out quickly, and it was though in 1912 that the first Polish edition was brought out. Now, it wasn't this anniversary, this 100th anniversary. It was another one for that time. An article I just recently read is that saying that Anne's joie de vivre, despite her own difficult circumstances, was like a tonic. The Polish people were going through difficult times in those years. Poland was the first to be invaded in that World War II European conflict. And they were actually given, Polish soldiers, copies of Anne of the Island to celebrate the values that they dearly fought for. Home, country, family. And this writer of this article goes on to say that during history's darkest hours, people found resilience through the strength of a single girl. May have been a fictitious girl, Anne, but it came through the pen of Montgomery. You'll notice that the name of Anne in these two Polish versions, Ania on the left, my left anyway, Anne, That's a version that came out just 1 month ago. Now, I was in touch with a woman who has a blog spot. She has Polish background herself, and there's a Polish version to her blog. And when I wrote to her, she says, you know, there's actually a debate going on in Poland. Everybody's talking about Gables. Polish people have believed for 110 years from when that first book came out that the title was Annie of Green Hill. Now, it's perhaps that in the translation, again, that Gables might look like a peak and then became hills. Well, says Bernadette to me in this email exchange, she says, you know, they may be debating about Gables, but the book is almost sold out 10 days after its launch, the end of January, just this year. So it's still very popular, even in Poland. Her blog spot, which I will encircle here in a second, has a lot of pictures on it, and I had wanted to use them, which is why I wrote to her. So she gave me permission to use them. So thanks, Bernadetta, for the pictures that we'll see of yours throughout this talk. Not only in Canada, of course, we celebrated the 100th birth of the book, Anne of Green Gables, but Japan also did. They had the same stamps, at least some of them, that Canada had. And they also had their own version. Yes, that's a typical style for the Japan version of Anne of Green Gables. We also find that the author had only translated, had only written it, had it published in 2008, pardon me. But it was in 2004 that a Canadian woman went out from New Brunswick to Japan. The book was not yet available for her to take. She was going to teach English and English literature. In 1932, she had gotten involved not just with teaching English, but also in helping publish books available that could be translated into Japanese. And one of the women that she met was Hanako, who had already gone to a missional school, had learned to love English, and she would be the one who translated Anne of Green Gables. Yes, mission school education, some in English. Literature and knowledge had become her lifeblood. She knew the value of good literature for young people. And she wanted to produce good literature in Japanese for young people. She translated books of Mark Twain. She translated Pearl Buck. She translated different ones, say, of the famous English authors. And she got this copy of Anne of Green Gables in 1939 as Loretta Shaw had to go back to Canada. It was during the war years. English was the language of the enemy. She set it aside waiting for the time of peace, but then she said no. Her house had a near miss in one of the bombings of Tokyo. She said, I've got to get this done. And so she translated, but it took time to get it published, even after the war ended. A story, a biography of her life, this Japanese translator of Anne of Green Gables and of so many other Western books, was written by her granddaughter, one of her granddaughters. And it's about Anne's Cradle, just showing the connection to that. And I just read that because it's a fairly new book. It only, in English at least, it only came out in 2021. I had to search around to get my copy. Fascinating book and worth a read in itself. And one of the reasons that was said, it was because she wanted it translated. She wanted it out there because it helped keep alive the hope that someday there would be peace again. She would see her Canadian, American, English language friends, and they wouldn't have to fight one another. Of course, it's come out in different versions since then. They've kept Anne, redheaded Anne, as she goes by, alive in Japan. Even in the 90s, in an area that needed a bit of boosting, for tourism, they started a theme park in Hokkaido, that very farthest northern island of Japan. And it featured Red-Headed Anne and the Canadian world in general. But Red-Headed Anne was the star of the theme park. In it, there were life-size replicas that the visitors could actually step into the world of Anne. And there were Annes walking around the site, for example. By 1997, I believe it was, economic issues came up that they could not keep that theme park alive in that same way. But when that was no longer possible, then there would still be the option to make that pilgrimage to the real home of Anne of Green Gables and even dress up like Anne of Green Gables. Prince Edward Island knows that tourism is an important aspect, and if they're going to have Japanese tourists coming to see Anne, Red-Headed Anne, they have their webpage available in Japanese. Now, having it in French is natural because French is one of our two official languages. And here I have a picture of two young friends of mine reading a book at their age level about Anne. Their grandma, or their mammy, as she is called by them, is involved with an organization called Lire et Faire Lire, read and get them to read. So this intergenerational program pairs volunteers with school children to help stimulate their taste for books and the pleasure of reading. There's that word again, the pleasure of reading. For older groups, there's a more direct translation, an old version, not even a direct translation, a version of it, we'll say, La Maison au Pignon Vert, and in this house of Green Gables. Apparently there is a new version coming out that actually uses the word Green Gables, but you have to say it with a French accent. The latest translation has been into Gaelic, and the press is based in Nova Scotia, in the Halifax area. The name they chose for their press means salmon and refers to the salmon of wisdom in Gaelic oral tradition. And you'll notice perhaps on that license plate, one version of a Nova Scotia license plate, or on the flag, there's that salmon curled up into the form of a G for Gaelic. Now, the founder and editor of that, I heard an interview with her, and she says that the humor of PEI, indeed Montgomery's own humor that she grew up with and was imbued with, that's Gaelic humor, that's Scottish humor. So when you're translating from one language to the other, sometimes it's hard to catch the humor, but in this case, it fit. It was Gaelic humor, Scottish humor. Between 1770 and 1815, there was a good influx of Scottish people, Gaelic-speaking Scottish people that had come over from the Highlands, from the islands, immigrated to Canada, and they settled mainly in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and in what is now Ontario. By 1870, another 170,000 more Scots had arrived. Again, you can read more about Scottish Canadians in the Canadian Encyclopedia. There's a diaspora, not a Bayeux tapestry that we're familiar with on Viking, but a Scottish diaspora tapestry that has been created over the years, wherever the Scottish have been dispersed to, voluntarily or otherwise. The Canadian portion of it has about 38 panels. You can actually go on the website and read a description of each of those 300 plus panels. Of the 38 from Canada, there are 5 from Prince Edward Island. One of the 5 of those panels related to Prince Edward Island depicts the 1864 Charlottetown Conference. It's very natural that they be included because our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, that was born in Scotland. Others of the leaders came into Canada from Scotland, got very involved in our politics. other Scottish immigrants had become involved in commerce. Well, think the fur trade, think banking, think building infrastructure such as our transcontinental train, think education. McGill University, where each member of our family has graduated from. Think Queen's University in Kingston. Think Dalhousie University in Halifax, started by the Earl of Dalhousie, who would later also be the Governor General of Nova Scotia. He based it on the principle of what he knew from University of Edinburgh, that it would be open to all, not just to elite, not just to a restricted form of education. It was at Dalhousie that Montgomery actually spent a year, and we'll see that in a few moments. They acknowledge right on their webpage that it is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, the First Nations that had arrived there before the Scots had come. Well, even before the Scots, but after the Mi'kmaq, the French had started exploring. Jacques Cartier's first voyage actually went around Prince Edward Island, but known then to the local Mi'kmaq people as the land that was cradled on the waves. If you think even of the shape of it, that cradle, and it was wrapped around by water. When we have now Champlain coming, a few decades later, the whole area would be named New France. And the parts of it then took on different names, and this island became known as Ile Saint-Jean. First French colony, though, was not started until about 1720, and it started right in the Port-la-Joie, which is in the harbor for Charlottetown. When the English came, they built a fort, Fort Amherst, in the very same area. And indeed, they did come and took over, occupied the land, removing the French from it, removing the Acadians there in 1755, right in those areas. And of course, they changed the name to the English version, the Island of St. John's or St. John's Island. Parishes and lots were identified and ready to grant to newcomers. It first fell under the jurisdiction of Nova Scotia. It was joined up, but then they got its own government. And the capital that was named was for the wife of George III. It was called Charlottetown. Again, about 30 years later, we've got that the name of the island became Prince Edward Island. Edward for the son of King George III. But the counties that were identified right back earlier in those days still bear about the same name. So we've got Prince County, Queens, and Kings. This was the period, that late 1700s, that Maud's ancestors on both sides of her family arrived in Prince Edward Island, and they settled in the area of Cavendish. So both sets of parents and their ancestors lived nearby, the McNeil family, the Montgomery family. On the Montgomery side, we have that there was a family lore that they descended from the Scottish Earls of Eglinton. Eglinton Street in Toronto is said to have come from that same family. Now, Hugh Montgomery, who arrived in about 1770, Lucy Maud Montgomery's great-great-grandfather, some say that he was on his way to Toronto, but others say no, he planned to be in Prince Edward Island. But in any case, when they got off the ship, his wife Mary refused to move on, and there she stayed. Over on the McNeil side, we've got, again, arriving about the same time. And we've got that there's two families that are going to be around for quite a while in the history of Prince Edward Island of those early years. We've got now a McNeil marrying a Simpson. That great-grandfather would become a speaker in the House of Assemblies, and so got involved in politics, one of those involved in politics. But we've also got that these two families, with another family, had actually founded Cavendish area. And there was a quote that that Maud's aunt, Mary, told many stories about in those early years. And you can see on that land map that we've got Clark, Simpson, McNeil, just taking over the whole area pretty well. Others would come. But one of the stories that she would quote, and this is actually in Montgomery's own autobiography called The Alpine Path. She says there was a proverb going around that said, from the conceit of her family, of the Stewart family, sorry, and the pride of the McNeils, and the vainglory of the Clark, good Lord, deliver us. Now, one of the other things that her Aunt Mary had said, they all intermarried, and so you'll see some with actually both names quite often. Now we're down to the grandparents level. And this is where the story of Lucy Maud Montgomery really becomes home to her. She was born in 1874, and her young 23-year-old mother, Clara McNeil, died. And when that happened, her father, Hugh John Montgomery, took the baby Maud over to live with the maternal grandparents. They were in the Cavendish area. So he would have had to leave his place where actually Maud had been born and where he had lived with his now deceased wife. And when Lucy Maud Montgomery went there as a baby and grew up there, it came a time where she decided she did not want to be called Lucy, her grandmother's name. Maud was her preferred name, which had been a name of one of Queen Victoria's daughter. But she insisted over those years that it was going to be Maud without the E. There's a little clue starting there about Anne with an E. Maud herself had insisted of Maud without an E. Born at Clifton, now New London, her parents, of course, had brought her to life there. She didn't stay for long, but that's where she was born. And it is now a historical site that can be visited. And it's been renovated to show how it was been, for those few years at least, that Lucy lived there. Although she lived there very few years, she would remember it and have some recollection of it that comes out in her diaries, in her journals. So Maud, like an orphan, had come to live in Cavendish then with her grandparents, and Anne, an orphan child, had arrived in Avonlea and lived with Matthew and Marilla. Now the homestead is just a homestead, very little left. The house that she lived in, not there. The kitchen, however, where the story of Anne was written, where the Cavendish post office had been moved off site. And then it was moved back on, right near the homestead. And this is thanks to Bernadetta, too, for she's seen this more recently, certainly, than I have, and sent me this picture. And so now there's a museum and artifacts in the bookstore just beyond it. And so that now can be visited right near the site of the homestead. And in a park that used to be called Cavendish Park, which is now called Montgomery Park, near the site of that homestead, there's a beautiful monument. And it's got Maud looking up into the sky, a glimpse of beauty. She just felt the breeze, felt what was around her. And online, you can actually read what the sculpture and the one who conceived of that sculpture would say about it. Now, notice, too, down on the ground and up by her other side, there are cats. Cats are very much a part of the story of Lucy Maud Montgomery herself. You can follow an itinerary, a literary tour, and you can get this offline. I've actually downloaded. It's like a self-guided tour put together by different governments, Canada, Prince Edward Island, put together by a resort material, put with Cavendish, and also by the Lucy Maud Montgomery Institute. You can find that, as I say, online, this literary tour. Around this landscape of where where Maud had grown up, I'm grateful that my childhood was spent in a spot where there were many trees. When I've lived with a tree for many years, it seems to me like a beloved human companion. And if you're familiar with the Anne books, Anne would name the trees, name a flower, name a road, very creative names. And this is really the type of thing that Maud herself would have done in her childhood, living there with her grandparents. Unfortunately, and I just found this out as I was doing this research, many of those trees that Maud so loved were blown down in a storm in 2019. But the old 100-year-old apple tree was still remaining. I have not seen this since then, to what has happened there. So the memories of that time living in that house were lasting. She would write about it quite often, would fit into her stories and into her journals, of course. Using, again, one of the children's books that I like to go to see, we find that although cousins lived nearby, Maud had a special friend named Katie Maurice, and she lived only in her imagination in the glass of an enchanted bookcase. And we know that Anne too had a friend of the very same name. Yes, Katie Maurice was there. That very enchanted bookcase is now actually in Silverbush, which was the home of Maud's McNeill Campbell cousins, and which is now part of Anne of Green Gables Museum. So you can go and take a look at yourself and see if you have an imaginary friend in there. Outside was the Campbell Pond, and it was the inspiration for the Lake of Shining Waters, that idyllic natural surroundings, which were such a delight to Maud, just as they were to her Anne. In Park Corner as well was the home of her paternal grandfather. And if you'll see that sign, it's still called Montgomery, the inn at Ingleside. It's used as an inn in this historic area as well. So you can actually book there. You can't get in, it's not likely to get in to visit a lot of the memorabilia that's in there, if there are guests, obviously, but you would have to call ahead. One of the things that Maud remembered was Ingleside, and actually has built that into two of her stories, Anne of Ingleside, Rilla, the youngest daughter of Anne and Gilbert. That's the setting at Ingleside. Also got her memories about two China dogs that were in Grandpa Montgomery's house, brought over apparently in 1775 by a Montgomery ancestor. And as a child, Maud was fascinated by them. In fact, when her father visited the grandpa's house with her, and he would say that those dogs came alive at night. They became part of Anne's story as well. Not in Anne of Green Gables, but further down in the series. Interestingly, it affected Maud so much that when she was in England on her honeymoon, she found her own set of dogs that didn't have the right color spots. They were a bit different size, and they were named like Gog and Magog. And the story goes that at one point when she was now living in Ontario, her eldest son came and was touring somebody around the house, and he saw those two dogs, and Gog and Magog, and he says, well, they're named God and My God. It would have stunned a few people. And so, oh, that's interesting. But when her grandfather died in 1893, Maud was just, 19 years old, she wrote down, I've loved him deeply. He was always very, very kind to me, and I shall miss him very, very much whenever I go to Park Corner. And she would return to Park Corner, even as an adult, just as often as she could. Clifton, where she was born, but only lived for less than 2 years as an infant, was about 11 kilometers, 7 miles from Park Corner. But when she moved and grew up in Cavendish, so that was another 7 miles, so that to get around from Cavendish to Park Corner would be, of course, about 14 miles. Remember, 14 miles in those days seemed a lot longer, took a lot more time than it would today. Today's Green Gable was built in the 1830s by, yes, McNeill relatives. And when Maud became so popular, Montgomery's writing known around the world, people would start to come to find Anne or to find Montgomery herself. The government actually made arrangements to buy this house from the McNeil relatives and redesign it, paint it, whatever it took to make it look like the book in Anne of Green Gables. Around that area were pathways that Maud could run, and that in the stories that Anne would adventure onto. Lover's Lane, Balsam Hollow, and there was the Haunted Wood. It was explored by Maud and her playmates, her cousins for the most part, and it was the same one that Anne with Diana would explore. The one-room schoolhouse was not far away, and Maud began her formal education at about age 6. Even at an early age, she was already writing poetry and keeping a journal. Her imagination had just flourished. At age 8 even, when the Marco Polo was driven ashore in Cavendish, and Maud took down detailed notes. She was also very pleased that actually the captain of that ship came back and stayed at her grandparents' house where she lived, and so could question them. Several years later, she submitted that story about the wreck of the Marco Polo and actually won a prize, but also it was published, and that was the best thing that it could happen for her at that time. At age 15, she crossed the country with her grandfather, Montgomery, who happened to be a senator in Canadian politics, and he had a pass on a train, and so he was able to accompany her out to Saskatchewan and then leave her there. Father had named his house very pretentiously Eglinton Villa, going back to that family lore that they had descended from the Earls of Eglinton back in Scotland. It didn't go well. She had hoped to find a home with her father, who was now remarried. But she and her stepmother, it didn't work. The stepmother was using her almost like a maid, a girl, and she couldn't get to school very often, Anne, and she wrote letters back to her cousins telling about the ordeal. And this has been published, some of these letters, and we also see that it's in journals that have since also been published. But during that stay, she had submitted a poem about a story she had been told, lore that she had been told of something that happened back in 1760s, a pirate story, a duel on the beach. And the poem was published in the Charlottetown newspaper. Other newspapers as well picked it up. It was that first sweet bubble on the cup of success. And of course, it intoxicated me. Why wouldn't it? A young 15, 16-year-old girl. She left and went back to Prince Edward Island, and a year later attended the Prince of Wales College to earn a teacher's license. Now, it was a 2-year program, but she did it in 1 year. She wanted to get out there. Even as she was doing that, studying 2 years in one, she would keep on writing and submitting yet more articles. 1961, Montgomery Hall was built and named for her. That hall still exists, but it's not part of Prince of Wales College anymore. It's actually part of the Prince of Wales campus of Holland College. And the only picture I could find that actually showed the name was where all the food sources were on the campus of Holland College. And in 1969, as it was, Prince of Wales College merged with St. Dunstan's and became Prince Edward Island, University of Prince Edward Island. The institute honoring Montgomery was founded in 1998. Her fame, you might say, kind of shrunk in the years and started coming up again in the 70s and 80s. And really has gotten going now for scholarship as well as just a good read of her books. The purpose of the Montgomery Institute is to promote research into and informed knowledge of the life, the works, so that would include the books we're talking about, the culture, the influence even of that Prince Edward Island born and acclaimed Canadian writer. You can find that online. Now, the tour that I talked to you about that had been for a 2020 tour, but of a conference that got canceled. That biennial conference is actually going to be started again this year in June. And that tour that was online is actually going to be able to happen live. Two of the keynote speakers, Elizabeth Epperly, who I quoted at the very beginning, and the granddaughter of that Japanese woman who translated Anne into Japanese. She's going to be featured there this very summer. It was the granddaughter who had written the story. So you can find that, more information about that online. The journal of this Montgomery Studies program is a scholarly publication from scholars all around the world, but yet it can be read so easily by others, readers, fans, because it's an open access journal, and you can see a lot of the different titles, quite fascinating. Some that refer to Sweden, some that actually refer to Anne over in Germany. After her 2 years in one at Prince of Wales College, she was able to teach at Biddeford and Belmont with a year in between to study English, Dalhousie University. The second school she taught at after that year is, well, it's not in Avonlea, it's actually in the one that was brought from Belmont. And had also become a teacher. And at the Avonlea School, it's, a challenge at times to distinguish between the life of the author and that which you created for Anne. The 1897-1898 school year in Lower Bedeque had some own particular challenges. The school building has since been moved, but it was the age of Queen Victoria. Young women had certain things that they had to do and things that they couldn't do. And one of the things is that she was engaged to one of her cousins. That cousin part wasn't so bad, but she ended up breaking that engagement because she had fallen madly in love with somebody else. And that was not to be done in Victorian era time. I have a very uncomfortable blend in my makeup, the passionate Montgomery blood and the Puritan McNeill conscience. It was the McNeill conscience that won out in that case for different reasons. And one was because her grandfather had died and she had to go suddenly back home to stay with her grandmother. She stayed until 1911, 13 years, except for a 9-month period out in Halifax working for a newspaper. When she went back, she could work in the post office, but she also had time to write. The advantage of that was she could send out her manuscripts without anybody knowing, and she was able to have them returned when they were refused without anyone knowing. 1902, she already has 3 articles published. By 1906, she had earned $700. She would be reading books that her grandmother was subscribed to. She would read other magazines that came through and brought out her own stories. One of the magazines was combining literature and fashion, Butterick magazines, McCall magazines. But there was one issue of the Delineator in April 1905. This is the time that Anne is being written. She includes an article about Hans Christian Andersen, that one who had felt himself like the ugly duckling but grew up to be a swan. Well, Anne herself had felt like the charity child in the family, and so maybe something could happen better for her too. Another article was about Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. That comes into the Anne story. From her notebook, she retrieved that seminal idea that would blossom into Anne of Green Gables. Elderly couple apply to orphan asylum for a boy. By mistake, a girl is sent them. And away she goes writing. She decided to make her Anne a real human girl, not just a good girl, Sunday school girl, or a moral girl. The manuscript was refused several times, and she put it in a hat box, but then it was accepted and finally published in 1908 by the Page Company of Boston. The picture on the cover was actually from one of those Delineator magazines. Should you imagine perhaps that Anne looked like that? It's changed over time. You can see it wasn't necessarily written for only children. The illustrator of that early version, I've encircled their name because I'm going to use those pictures in some of the story of Anne of Green Gables. First edition. Look who got a copy of it, Mark Twain. Himself an acclaimed humorist writer too. And he said that Anne is the dearest, most lovable child of fiction since the immortal Alice in Wonderland. The sweetest creation of child life yet written. Imagine how Maud must have felt getting that kind of accolade from none other than Mark Twain. So she got going, and we're going to actually go through a few of the highlights that I found as highlights of her book, Chapter 1, Anne of Green Gables. We've got Matthew going off to pick up Anne, but Mrs. Rachel Lynde is watching everything that goes on in that area in Avonlea. And she finds out that they're going to hire a boy, or they're going to adopt a boy to have Matthew in the farm. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised when he gets to the train station, and what is waiting for him? Not a boy, but Anne. He says, well, I'm going to have to take you home for the night, and didn't want to tell her what was going to maybe happen. She was going to be sent back. Well, the horse is over in the yard. Give me your bag. And then he gets his first taste of Anne. Oh, I can carry it. It isn't heavy. I've got all my worldly goods in it, but it isn't heavy. And if it isn't carried in just a certain way, the handle pulls out, and so I better keep it because I know the exact knack of it. It's an extremely old carpet bag. Matthew's head must have been spinning, and she continues to ask him questions. What's the name of that? What's this? What that? Matthew's common answer was, well, now, I don't know. He's got to face Marilla back at home. But she says, well, isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find about? It just makes one so glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew all about everything, would it? Oh, there'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? Actually, it's tiring out perhaps Matthew, but he's getting to like her. Marilla Cuthbert is then surprised. What's this? Where's the boy? And she's, what's your name, girl? Oh, you can call me Cordelia? Is that your name? No, it's Anne, but A-N-N-E. It looks so much more distinguished. She then begins to find out that they wanted a boy. You don't want me. You wanted a boy. She's been highly disappointed. And she said, that's the most tragical thing that ever happened to me. And she goes to bed knowing that the next day she's going to be returned and upstairs in the East Gable, a lonely, heart-hungry, friendless child, cries herself to sleep. The next morning, she's on her way, and she's no longer in the depths of despair. It's a beautiful day, and she's always learned that you can always, nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. And now Marilla has heard her story about the triple set of twins that she's had to care for, the orphanage, and she's made up her mind. And she's going to keep Anne, but going to train her properly, and so teaches her how to say prayers. Anne didn't know how to say prayers. Well, Anne's reply is that people who have to look after twins can't be expected to say their prayers, can they? I'll learn one. So the prequel, actually, that came out in 2008 and approved by the Montgomery heirs, tells of Anne's birth parents, their death, as well as the time living in two different families, including that one with 3 sets of twins, and at an orphanage. And it ends with 11-year-old Anne crossing on the ferry, arriving at the train station, and she rose without a word or a backward glance, and clutching that bag with both hands, walked along the aisle and down the steps of the train into her new life. Anne's bringing up has begun and told she mustn't make up stories, but what would she do without Katie Maurice? Mrs. Lynde comes to check it out and comments about Anne's hair. Now, an adult can say things to a child, perhaps, but children aren't supposed to say things back to adults. But she said, you are a rude, impolite, unfeeling woman. How would you like to be told that you are fat and clumsy? Of course, she, as a child, is going to have to apologize to the adult. And from her valley of humiliation, she makes a dramatic apology to Mrs. Lynde, and quite pleased with her apology, too. Sunday school, she wasn't very impressed with it, but at least she found also her kindred spirit in Diana Barry. And that will be obviously part of the story. Gilbert, says Diana, is awfully handsome, but when he says carrots, carrots, she smashes him over the head with the slate, and you probably remember this story, and vows never to forgive him. And her new interest in life later on is to beat Gilbert. Diana's invited to tea. Anne hosts her own most grown-up-ish tea party, which is going to have, yes, some raspberry cordial. Oh, I didn't know raspberry cordial was so nice. And of course, it was currant wine. And Diana gets drunk. She's never allowed to play with Anne again. But when the parents and the grown-ups are off to a monster mass political rally in Cavendish, in Charlottetown, Anne saves the younger sister, Minnie May, from the croup, and all is forgiven. This is actually one paragraph that I really like working with. Beginning of the chapter, it says, spring has come once more to Green Gables, that beautiful, capricious, reluctant Canadian spring. And it goes along through April and May in a succession of days with pink sunsets and miracles of resurrection. The wordplay, the usage of word, the art of words that Montgomery used is really fascinating me in this reread of Anne of Green Gables. It's a beautiful use of words. But there was also the dark sides that haunted Wood, that Anne's imagination had just gone too far. And she has this chance to bake a cake for the visiting minister and his wife. And instead, of course, she's using something very different. An actual incident happened like this at the Binford School when Anne was staying there in the manse. So that fit into her story. She's invited out to tea, a return visit. And she learns about a new teacher, a woman teacher. This is a topic of discussion. A woman teacher. Sometimes women teachers may have been there, but as soon as they got married, they weren't supposed to. This is Miss Stacy who's coming. Marilla had almost begun to despair of getting into any kind of form, this waif of the world, to make her a model of demure manners and prim deportment now. But you know what? Neither would she have believed that she really liked Anne much better as she was. Anne decides to start a story club about her 13th birthday, and the story writing is business. The foolishness yet, says Marilla. Oh, but there's going to be a moral. That should be okay, Marilla. Montgomery herself wrote the comment, the kind of juvenile story I like best to write and read too, for that matter, is a good, jolly one. Art for art's sake, or rather fun for fun's sake. No insidious moral hidden away in it like a pill in a spoonful of jam. But drama comes in again. In the stories dramatizing Tennyson's poem on the Barry's Pond, Elaine, which now is known as Anne, is about to flow away on her barge. We must kiss her quiet brow. As she floats away, she finds there's a leak. Melodrama increases. Worse still, it's Gilbert who has come to the rescue. Well, we're going to quickly go through these last few chapters. The years are slipping by, and Anne studies for entrance exams for Teachers College, 2 years and 1, and she needs a break from studying before actually going on if she passes the entrance exam, which she does. And at that, she wins a 4-year scholarship for further study. The horizons of her ambition shifted and broadened as if by magic. And then Matthew dies. Anne is going to have to go home because Marilla's having to sell Green Gables. No, it can't be. And so she gives up this scholarship and looks for a teaching job in Avonlea. Now, the Avonlea school was already spoken for, and who other but by Gilbert. Gilbert gives up that post so Anne can go to have that Avonlea post. She makes peace with the future, and she says that she's just as ambitious as ever, but the object of her ambition has changed. She's going to stay and help Marilla, and she's going to study online, something like what's happening these days, isn't it? She says that I'll give life here my best, but I believe it will give its best to me in return. My future seemed to stretch out before me like a straight road, but now there's a bend in it. I don't know what lies around the bend, but I'm going to believe that the best does. It has a fascination of its own, Marilla, that bend. Well, Montgomery herself, when her grandfather died, had a similar choice to make, and she held on to her dream, nevertheless, even going back to live with her grandmother. Anne came to life during those years. Other bends in the road were still ahead for Montgomery herself. Amazing success. She was pressed to continue. She hadn't planned to. The story of Avonlea was just the next year, so she had to write rather frantically. Those first 2 books were written in Cavendish area. other books came along, and you'll see that two of them actually came much later. They were plugged into the story. The ninth book actually just came out in 2009. Part one of it includes poetry and letters, and part two comes after the war, well, part one before. Walter, Anne and Gilbert's son, had died in the war. So it's a bit darker book. Maybe that's why it hadn't gotten published right away. The full manuscript was published only in 2009. It had been submitted to the publisher the day before Montgomery's death. Maud had had to leave her home when her grandmother McNeill had died. She then felt free to marry and went on to marry the man she had met years earlier, even while he was a pastor or a minister in Cavendish. They went off to Scotland and England and returned, settled in Leaskdale in Ontario, where Ewan had become the minister. There's signs there telling her story. There's an association that celebrates the 100th anniversary of when she arrived in Leaskdale. Things that happened there was 3 sons were born. Hugh, the middle one, actually died, though, at birth. We've had Ewan suffering mental health issues. Maud herself was affected both by his suffering and by her own depressions, periods of depressions. Maud would visit Prince Edward Island to get some rest and recuperation. More books were written. A first movie came out. And an 8-year legal battle with Page and Company began, and she stuck to it to the end. International recognition came her way. She became the first Canadian woman of the Royal Society of Arts. Then they moved and lived from 26 to 35 in Norval. On the map there, I've tried to show by the A and the B where Leaskdale is in relationship to Norval and to Toronto. Oh, but that stock market crashed. So she couldn't write just for pleasure or occasional finances, even though money was coming in. She had to write books. More international recognition came her way from France, and then finally moved to a house of her own in Toronto. 1935, and she named the place Journey's End, hoping to live there until her journey ended. That's when those 2 last books were sort of plugged back into the Anne series. And she had Anne of Ingleside saying at one point, which was probably definitely her own words, the power to escape at will. Imagination can help you amazingly through the hard places of life. Get into a book. Well, back in 36, where it had all began, she was honored around when the area around Cavendish had been chosen for a national park, and Green Gables was opened the following year. Her last visit to Cavendish was in 39, and she could say, like Anne, it's lovely to be going home and to know it's home. Journey's End has a plaque nearby, and it summarizes the story of her life, but so much more is now known. The Alpine Path was an autobiography first published back in the days when she was there in Leaskdale. The Alpine Path has been a hard climb. After so many years, it wasn't an easy ascent, but even in the struggle, its hardest, there was a delight and a zest known only to those who aspired to the heights. If you don't try, you may get disappointed, but you'll never succeed, perhaps, either. That was the same year, in 1917, that women gained the vote in Ontario. So Montgomery had inspired women not only to become women's writers, but to let their voice be heard. There's actually in the University of Guelph nearby a research center, and you can see all sorts of archival pictures of Montgomery. And actually, copyright is expired for those, and according to Canadian law, and so we can get and look at them and see and enjoy them ourselves. Another website, fantastic to look at for academics and researchers, yes, but also for readers and fans like we ourselves might be. It's worth looking on that particular website as well. The selected journals had been published in 1980s, 1990s, and now we've got complete journals that are going through right from the time that Maud herself started keeping actively her journals when she was 14. The earlier ones she had actually thrown out and kind of regretted doing them. And one of the final books to really, I recommend this highly, is this book by Mary Rubio, Lucy Maud Montgomery, A Gift of Wings, came out in 2008, and used those journals as primary source. So I'm going to be ending with words that Rubio uses to explain Maud Maud Montgomery, and how it relates even to Anne. Maud had lived much of her life like her volatile little heroine, Anne, between the soaring of the imagination and the depths of despair. Yes, Montgomery had gone through the depths of despair. Montgomery's gift of wings, that passionate nature that brought her both depth and glory and fed her art, began to sink under the pressure of flight. She herself had said that success had not been always enough to calm her inner turmoil. And she said, I wish that the honors, though, would take away all the bruises of my soul and spirit. She died suddenly at home in Toronto, 1942, April 24th. She was buried with honors in her death at home in Cavendish. And it was in Cavendish where Maud had herself spent such formative years, even as a child and as an author. It was in Cavendish where she brought Anne to life. The seaside, the lands, the flowers, the trees, the smell of that, all that was around her, she remembered dearly. In 1911, she had written, as she left Cavendish for her honeymoon and for Ontario, I had left Cavendish forever, save as a fitful visitor, and in leaving it, I felt I was leaving the only place on earth my heart would ever truly love. The legacy she left behind for us, books that have raised the spirit of millions of readers all over the world. They're books that changed lives. They inspired innumerable women to create greater heights of achievement. They brought courage, and they brought hope to those Polish soldiers in the trenches. They brought millions of people from all over the world to see the landscapes that she wrote about and loved so much there in Prince Edward Island. Most important of all, her books helped us laugh. Laughter, that's so important, at human foibles, maybe at our own foibles, bringing readers into a shared human community. Her best books conveyed a joy in life that has lived on long after the creator departed from the shores of time. So with that, I'm going to invite you to take time to perhaps rediscover Anne, discover more about Lucy Maud Montgomery, discover Prince Edward Island. Maybe it will be by a land visit, or maybe it'll be on a cruise visit. So with that, I say enjoy World Book Day, whether it's this Thursday, but each day of the year, wherever in the world you may be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. We've got some questions now which have come in during the presentation. I'm going to start with one from Damien. He's in Springfield in the United States. He says, Anne comes across as such a positive character. What do you admire about her, and what do you think she teaches her readers about making the best of life despite difficult beginnings?
It's like you begin to wonder sometimes, but even though Maud Montgomery didn't want to put a pill in a thing of jam to get over, it gives us hope. And that's what it did. I find some of the quotes that Maud Montgomery actually writes into it. She wanted to see the best in things. She had her own difficult times, and she teaches us to take the idea that the bend in the road ahead, we don't know what's there. And it could be difficult things. And we know that there are difficult things happening around the bends in road for several people, even this time, even this day. But there's hope that something, maybe another bend further on, might make things different. And I think that's what I want to take around. It's humor. I also love the humor. I really love the humor of it and laughing at these foibles. So to me, it's looking at things the best way you can. Somehow we'll get through it. I mean, today we'll get over. Next year we'll get over. COVID will get over. And there's a bend in the head, and there may be some positive things that come through these difficult times. So that's the message of Anne, but it's really the message of Lucy Maud Montgomery, her own difficult times in life. And she wanted to bring cheer and joy as well. It might be Pollyanna-ish, might not be realistic, but it gives us hope that there could be better things ahead. That's my main take from it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beth. A question here from Enid in the United States, and she said, did Lucy Maud Montgomery base the character of Anne on a child or a person that she knew? Was the story somewhat autobiographical?
There are definitely autobiographical parts in it because of the setting even. She, as I mentioned in one spot, she herself was like, oh, what do we call it? The charity child. She lived with her grandparents, so almost like an orphan because her father had left her behind and didn't reconnect with her. And she had Anne as an orphan. Teaching, 2 years in one, preparing for teaching school. Anne had done that. Montgomery had done that. So there's lots of her own experience that comes into it. Even the quote about the elderly couple ask for a boy and get a girl. There was a family member who had, a brother and sister in the Neal family who had wanted a boy and apparently actually had gotten a girl. And that was kind of in the background. So she took life experiences that she actually had lived. Lover's Lane, The Mirror, The Enchanted Bookcase, and wove it in. It's not completely biographical. Actually, the series of Emily is apparently more autobiographical than even that. So there are definite autobiographical aspects in it. But she just wanted Anne to be a real girl with all her difficult times and all her mistakes, and that's what normal kids are like.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got Donna in New York, and she says, do we know which authors Lucy Maud Montgomery liked to read and who inspired her to become a writer?
She figured that it was almost in her genes. All those MacNeil ancestors way back into Scotland were known to be writers and poets, and around the family tables with her Aunt Mary or other family get-togethers, they would tell these stories. They would go back and read the poetry. And she says in her journals that it was that family heritage that she felt was almost in her genes, hearing the stories and creating imagination. It was kind of absorbed it from her own upbringing. Her grandfather did not at all encourage, in fact, discouraged her getting further education, thought her stories were nonsense. Her own father, when Anne showed him a poem that she had written at age 9, I don't understand this. And she's, well, it's free form. It's free verse. Well, yeah, it is that, definitely. And he kind of left her discouraged with that. But she pushed on. And by reading lots of magazines, having been there in the post office where magazines came in and books came in, it inspired her. So she had a lot of inspiration from different sources.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got Lillian. She's in Midland, I think in the United States, and she says, was Avonlea based on a particular town in Prince Edward Island?
Yeah, it was really the Cavendish setting where Maud grew up herself. What I found very interestingly was that in 1912, so just a few years after the book was first published, in fact, by then both Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Avonlea were out. There's a town in Saskatchewan, about 40 miles from Regina, actually where I was born, they named it in 1912, incorporated as Avonlea. I said, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that town before, but Avonlea was just taken on. I'm not really sure where she picked the name Avonlea from, something she read, but definitely the setting is like Cavendish, and that's why they've even built Cavendish Village, Avonlea Village, in the area of Cavendish now. It was fictitious name. Where she originally got it from, I really don't know.
Thank you. A question here from Jane in Sheffield, and she says, were the books instantly popular and critically acclaimed when they were first published, or did their popularity grow over the years?
Definitely the first two books, and it was particularly Anne of Green Gables. By in 1908, when it was published, that first month, I think it was April, or that, it had to be reprinted every month, right up into December. In fact, the version that Japanese translator bought, that Shaw had brought over from Canada to Japan, was the December version of Anne of Green Gables, because it had sold out so fast. And when you get a writer like Mark Twain praising it, some of those first editions, that of course spreads the knowledge of it. it had been refused several times, but somehow somebody caught the idea. This could go over. And it just met with the funny bone. But again, it's the word description that she gives. It's beautiful read just in terms of art of words. So definitely very popular. The other books, as far as I can remember, and even how I personally feel, were not as popular. Maud Montgomery herself said, when she was getting to about chapter 30 in Anne of Green Gables, where Anne was growing up, and she says, you really can't tell a lot of funny stories of these young people that are growing up into mature years. I can't make her do as funny things or as funny says, but she does still manage to get Anne to have some humor in the later books. The first books went very rapidly into popularity.
Fantastic, thank you. A question here from Amy. She's in Windsor in Ontario, and she says, which of the past TV adaptations do you think does the best job of bringing the stories to life?
Oh, this comes to a personal opinion. I just like the very first one with Megan Follows. Sometimes it's The First Love. I followed that probably with our kids in the 85s when it started. To me, that's what Marilla and Matthew should like, what Anne should look like. For me, that's the best one, the 1985 series that we had on TV with Megan Follows. Personal opinion, obviously.
Perfect, thank you. And a question here from Marilyn. She's in the United States, and she said, I read this book over 60 years ago and it's still close to my heart. Why do you think that Anne of Green Gables has such a strong impact?
It's that idea that the yearnings and the longings that Anne had, but maybe are in us all. Hope, humor, playing, not getting everything right, being able to make mistakes and be able to laugh about it eventually and to move on. For me, yes, it's the humor of it and being able to identify with the people. And when I read her descriptions, that one I read about the spring day that had come, it may not be applicable here in British Columbia. We have flowers that are coming out in January and February in most springtime and winters. But I can almost smell Prince Edward Island and even Quebec, where I spent most of my years, that spring that comes and then goes and it's cool. And to me, it's the words, now that I've reread it, even later, that come as much as the humor. It's those unforgettable humorous scenes. I think I actually prefer rereading it to even rewatching the movies. The words come more alive to me than perhaps even the movie does. Maybe that's your experience, but to me, I identify with it. I think there's lots of people, even boys can identify with it. Even men can see the humor of these human foibles that we hear about. Mrs. Lind. Who doesn't know a Mrs. Lind? Who doesn't know the school teacher that Anne had first? Or Miss Stacy, who inspired. Who doesn't know an inspiring school teacher? I think that's part of the ongoing thrill, the ongoing interest in Anne.
Wonderful, thank you. A personal question here from Marjorie. She's in Wichita, and she says, thank you for this fascinating presentation. Can you tell us about how you personally shared the Anne stories with your own family?
I would read them to these two young lads. Often you think it's for girls, and so we would read them out together. I actually had some pictures. I don't know if it's, do you think it's possible to go down to the next slide or two? Can we get that up by maybe chance? James, can you come on to a slide? I'm just looking to see how books, Anne, and PEI fit into our family life. I don't know if you can get on to that slide. I don't see it on my screen. I only see Heather's picture here. Okay, how books and Anne and PEI fit into our family life. So I'll just talk about it. Well, for one thing, books were made very much a part of my family life. So it's a picture I have here, but I'd taken it out. I didn't think I had enough time. Books. I love books, and I've got in my office right now a stack of books, and I still have a stack of books to read. I would read closely with the boys and animate it. So I would give the humor, I would enact. They then, even with their dad, would read books, and Anne of Green Gables was obviously one of them. They would read it by themselves in different versions for children, but I would read the actual story. We would go down to Prince Edward Island for holidays, and we actually rented a farmhouse there that I figured must have looked somewhat like what Anne lived in, and actually what Montgomery herself lived in. And we would walk down a path, a red earth path, and we would ask, well, why is this earth so red? Especially when the little ones, 1 year old, just learning to walk, fell into it. And we would asked the owner, who happened to be named Chester. He says, why is the earth red? And he says, well, no, I don't know. A little bit like that. It's because of the iron oxide, and it turns rusty. Where our little guys learn to topple and wobble on the beaches there. And we would go back year after year, so that even though they wobbled the first year, and we would go and see the sights that Anne of Green Gables would have seen, that Maud herself would have seen. We would go, as they grew older, to visit the area. We had to get to Prince Edward Island on a ferry, and the Confederation Bridge actually opened 1997 after we quit traveling by car down there. And it was opened by Premier Joseph Giz. Now there's a park named for him, and it's start of Confederation Trail, but it's also the meeting place where the Cass Canada Trail came. Now, our grandchildren have since been born, and where they were born in Montreal too, the grandchildren as well as our children, there was a Trans-Canada Trail pavilion where we could put up the names. Well, because we had such memories of Anne of Green Gables, of Prince Edward Island, I actually put our grandchildren's name on that pavilion in Charlottetown. And when I go there, I go and I look at the name of my grandchildren. And of course, our children, who are now grown with children of their own, will go and see that. And that's part of the heritage that I tried to hopefully pass on. I don't know how much my grandchildren have read of Anne of Green Gables, because they've actually lived overseas in a different environment. But I sure would love to see them read it and enjoy it even more. So that's kind of sharing by living on site and by reading about it and talking about it, and even reminding them to take a look at this video presentation when they have a chance to do it.
Wonderful.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Beth. We've just got one last question here to end on for tonight. This one's from Diana in Williamsburg, and she says, I love Anne's mantra, you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. I think this message is important still today, to look for joy and pleasure wherever you can. Would you agree?
Yes, it's not always easy to do. And I think it takes time, and different personalities would feed it differently. I think it's important to acknowledge that we have our difficult days, and it's something that's hard to manage. And I think this is why the family of Lucy Maud Montgomery actually told the story of Maud's own life. It comes off as a cross, happy time, but I just said very briefly, if you noticed, about she died suddenly. Actually, the newspaper article said that she died of heart failure. The family at the time of that death had found her body with pills beside it, and with what appeared to be a suicide note. And for years, until 2008, they had kept that to themselves. They were willing to share that difficult belief of the author of Anne of Green Gables with others, thinking, you know, people do go through mental health issues. There is difficult times in life. As it turns out, in that book that I quoted at the last, the Anne with her wings, flying on the wings, explains that it's possible, rather, that it was actually an accidental overdose of drugs, not a suicide. Accidental overdose because she and her husband had to took painkillers for their inner turmoil, for their outer pain. And the paper that was interpreted as a suicide note was actually had a number on it, 176. And it looked like how she often wrote her journals. So pages 1 to 175 were missing, and this may have been just page 176, where she was talking about her own inner turmoil. And she talks freely about her depression. So she doesn't put it all sugar-coated in her own journals. She wanted to give a book, though, that could raise the spirits. And that's what her gift was, to offer hope and encouragement. And it has good value, some of those quotes of Anne, but know that there are difficult times, that it's not just say snap out of it and go through. And there's time, maybe books can help us get through the difficult times. And we can always often find something good that's going to come. Perhaps it's only around the bend that we find it. That's my moderated response.